Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this next edition of our series of regular Brexit updates for FTA members. I'm now going to take you through the webinar, tell you the background to it, and what we're covering, and a few rules, house rules for the webinar. First of all, I'm your chairman for today, and I'm Chris Welsh. I'm FTA's Director of Global and European Policy. So I have overall responsibility for FTA's global and European teams, and importantly our Brussels team that are key players in our overall Brexit service to members, but also our on-the-ground representation in Brussels vis-a-vis Brexit. So I'm delighted to be joined by Sarah Laudou, who is our European policy manager, and Sarah, in fact, will be doing most of the talking today through the webinar, and will update you on the key areas that FTA is involved in, mainly from a Brussels dimension. But what we will be covering today is an update on the status of the negotiations, go into a bit of detail on the political agreement on the transition period, which was agreed a couple of weeks ago by heads of state. Look at the EU guidelines on post-Brexit arrangements, and in particular bring out some of the challenges that are going to be presented for specific and particular types of products where there will be requirements related to sanitary checks. And then right at the end, I'll give you an update on FTA events and other activities aimed at bringing members completely up to speed with what is happening, mainly obviously from a freight and logistics angle, and the wider supply chain arrangements that fit into that, and of course the customs arrangements that are going to be an essential part of that. So if you move on, Sarah, to the next slide, what I'd like to do is introduce a few house rules to hopefully make the webinar run a bit more effectively, and that is we would ask attendees to keep their microphone on or telephone muted. Just to let you know that we are recording all the webinars, and the recording will be available on the FTA website, as indeed there is a library of the previous webinars that we've held. We won't be able to deal with any technical issues and questions other than those that you place on the chat box. So if you've got a question that comes to mind as we run through the webinar, you can place that in the chat box, and if there's a few minutes at the end, we will try and deal with that. If not, we will place the answer on our website along with the recording of the webinar itself. And if you want to get in touch with either myself or Sarah via email, please do. So on to the next slide, Sarah. And what I'd like you to do, Sarah, is open us up with the state of play on the negotiations.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to take you through this webinar today, starting with, as Chris just said, the state of play of negotiations, the latest update. So since our last monthly webinar, there were a few important milestones in the negotiations, although much remains to be done. Let me start with a reminder. As you know, the negotiation has been structured in two different work streams. And the first one is about the so-called withdrawal issues. Withdrawal issues are those topics that have to be addressed to ensure that the UK leaves the EU in an orderly fashion. It is strictly about separation issues, like citizen rights, the financial settlement, solutions for the island of Ireland, and other separation issues, such as what happens with goods placed on the market before Brexit. The transition is also part of this first work stream, and it would have to be secured in a withdrawal agreement. So this is ongoing, and I will provide details on the political agreement on the transition that was reached on the 19th of April. So that was for the first work stream. The second work stream is about defining the future relationship between the UK and the EU once the UK has left, or after the transition period, if such a transition is included in a withdrawal agreement. So currently, both work streams are now active in parallel, although most resources are now dedicated to securing the withdrawal agreement, so that discussions on the future relationship remain limited for the time being. So starting with a bit more detail on the political agreement on the transition period. Just 1 month ago, the UK and the EU27 secured this political agreement on the transition. It is a very good signal, because if it does become legally binding, it would relieve pressure and give negotiators more time to clarify the conditions of the future relationship, and it would avoid a cliff edge next year for all stakeholders, companies, authorities. So within this political agreement, the transition has been defined, and both parties have agreed on how long it would last and what the rules would be during the transition period. So it would last from the 30th of March 2019 to the end of 2020. According to this political agreement, during the transition period, the status quo would be maintained. And it means that for this period, trade between the EU27 and the UK could continue under the same terms as today. For example, in terms of customs, in terms of border arrangements, and so on. It also means that the UK will continue benefiting from EU trade agreements with the rest of the world during the transition. This has been explicited in the political agreement, which says exactly that the EU will notify those countries with which there is a trade agreement signed with the EU that the UK should still benefit from the same conditions during the transition as if it had remained a member state for this specific period of time. So having the status quo preserved during the transition period also means that businesses would not have to adapt twice, which is very good news, because this would have been a huge hurdle and would have implied many complications. Although it's good news, a word of caution here, because the transition only gives clarity until the end of 2020. The conditions for trade, customs, borders, and transport after this date, after the end of the transition period, remain to be negotiated. And another word of caution, an important one, although there is a political agreement on the transition, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. The transition has to be made legally binding as part of the withdrawal agreement, which contains other tricky aspects that could jeopardize the agreement, the withdrawal agreement, and the transition. It means that if any of these pending topics prevent negotiators from concluding the withdrawal agreement in time, there would be no transition period. So looking at some of these pending topics that could jeopardize the withdrawal agreement and the transition if negotiations do not progress well enough. At this stage, the question of the island of Ireland is the main issue that could be complicated. Negotiators have to find a solution to ensure that there is no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, while leaving the customs union and the single market is an important red line for the UK government. So the challenge is to reconcile these two objectives. Ireland and the EU 27 are now insisting on finding so-called backstop arrangements, which means a solution whereby a specific solution would be secured for the island of Ireland, irrespective of what happens regarding the overall relationship between the rest of the UK and the EU. So discussions on Ireland restarted last week and continued until yesterday, where there was another of these negotiation meetings. Transport was on the agenda last week, with the objective to secure a solution that would work even in the absence of a wider agreement. Options to secure this included mutual recognition of operator licenses across the border, as well as mutual recognition of CPC. But please bear in mind that we're only talking about transport on the island of Ireland, not transport between Ireland and Great Britain, at least during this specific meeting covering Ireland as part of the withdrawal negotiations. In terms of timeline, a breakthrough on Ireland by June will be crucial, as the next EU summit with EU leaders is scheduled at the end of June. Otherwise, there would be serious questions as to whether it is possible to finalize the withdrawal agreement, which contains the transition period, by the end of this year, which is the deadline to leave sufficient time for ratification before Brexit Day. So looking now at the future relationship and what happens after a transition period, if such a transition period is secured. In parallel to the negotiations on the transition period and the withdrawal agreement, work restarted this week on the future relationship as well, so on what happens after the transition period. Both negotiation streams, the transition and the future relationship, take place simultaneously now, but currently the discussion on the future remains high level and will probably not go into the nitty-gritty before the transition and withdrawal part are finalized. Nevertheless, there was an important milestone regarding the future relationship when the EU 27 published the so-called negotiation guidelines on the 23rd of March. These guidelines are the EU's negotiating position, what they want to achieve post-Brexit. Of course, as it is a negotiation, the outcome depends on both parties, but the guidelines give a good indication of what topics the EU 27 want to address and how. So having a look at the guidelines, a number of important topics are mentioned, showing there is a willingness to address them and to find solutions during the negotiations. Transport is mentioned. The EU 27 want arrangements to ensure continuity of transport services post-Brexit in all transport modes. This is good news, and indeed something that was not obvious, as references to transport had been previously limited to aviation only. So to achieve this goal, preserving the continuity of transport services, one or several transport agreements are required. And the guidelines suggest that transport could be dealt with in separate agreements, not in the overall free trade agreement. While transport agreements seem to be on offer, it comes with certain conditions. The EU 27 is insisting on preserving a level playing field, meaning that they are likely to ask the UK to keep EU rules in the field of transport. And it remains to be seen if this would be considered acceptable on the UK side. It will be, of course, a major topic within the negotiations. A side note here on how this topic, transport arrangements post-Brexit, is addressed at UK level. In case negotiators do not manage to finalize these transport agreements in time, the UK government is working on contingencies regarding access to the road transport market. This is dealt with in the Road Haulage Bill, which gives the Department for Transport the powers to run a permit system if one is needed, a permit system to allow trucks to access the EU market, to allow UK trucks to access the EU market and vice versa. This bill, the Road Haulage Bill, entered in third reading in the House of Lords on Tuesday this week. FTA has been defending the interests of the logistics community extensively, and many members flagged our concerns in the House of Lords debate this week. So if you wish more information on the Road Haulage Bill, I refer you to the previous webinars which addressed this topic, and whose recordings are available on the FTA website. And of course, you're also very welcome to contact me with specific questions on access to the road market or the haulage bill. But going back to the guidelines and what the EU want to address in the negotiation for the future relationship. Trade and customs are also mentioned, and the guidelines make it clear the EU is willing to sign a free trade agreement with the UK after Brexit, although such an agreement could not be in place before Brexit Day next year. So regarding customs, the EU's intention is to have zero tariffs in all sectors and to have no quotas either. But the EU also wants to make sure that goods from the rest of the world, which do not benefit from zero rates with the EU, will not re-enter the European market through the back door after having transited through the UK. So it means that UK traders would have to comply with rules of origins, which are cumbersome mechanisms to prove that the UK content in a product is sufficient to benefit from preferential arrangements like zero rates. So still something to bear in mind, even though the intention to find customs arrangements is good news. So on customs, the guidelines also indicate that the EU is willing to have customs cooperation mechanisms that will have to be negotiated. So we don't know yet what they could look like. And solutions based on the Common Transit Convention could also be considered, and possibly security and safety waivers, like in some agreements with other countries, including Switzerland. So this is what's in the negotiation guidelines regarding customs. But Chris also attended a joint customs consultative committee recently, and can maybe update everyone on that, Chris, if you want to.
Yeah, there were a number of important things that came out of that meeting. I think you'll all be aware that in addition to a road haulage bill, there will be a customs bill as well. And no doubt everybody has picked up this morning the vote in the House of Lords over the amendment on the customs union. So this gives you an indication that this is going to be not an easy ride necessarily for the government, as evidenced by the substantial majority and how that will play out in the House of Commons. So at the moment, the government has just laid down the framework for a customs bill, and that will cover also excise and VAT. The detail of that will be filled in with secondary legislation, which is actually the detail of the rules. And that's where we anticipate a lot of amendments to be tabled when that occurs. But what was important, confirmed at the recent customs Joint Consultative Committee was that it was made clear that the UK will align with the Union Customs Code classification arrangements. And that's vitally important. So members and importers, exporters in particular, will know that at least during the full transition period, they will be working to the Union Customs Code in terms of classifying their goods. And there was a strong indication that the government has no intention of introducing a completely new classification system. So even beyond the transition period, beyond a deal or no deal, UK will use the Union Customs classification system for goods. Or the words that were actually used were to mirror as closely as possible, and I think that caveat is there clearly to recognise there could be some divergences over time. Also importantly, during the transition stroke implementation period, existing customs procedures and border controls will remain unchanged. Now, clearly, that could change over time as we move into new arrangements in the longer term, but at least we have some assurance for members that the existing arrangements will remain in place. Now, regarding VAT and excise arrangements, the government will consult more generally on VAT, and we are now awaiting a statement from the Chancellor, who will release plans for VAT, and that will form the basis of a consultation with stakeholders, of which, of course, FTA will participate in. So that's some really recent news, which I hope will give will give members some guarantees of where they stand regarding classification. Over to you, Pauline. Sorry, Sarah.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for this update on what's happening on the UK side on customs. Going back to the guidelines on the future relationship and what the EU 27 intend to address in the negotiation, it's also important to mention that professional qualifications are referenced in the guidelines. It's an important point for FTA and for FTA members, especially because it would be necessary for drivers, for instance. So a good point that it's mentioned. And the last point on the guidelines, they also mention sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which means the negotiations are likely to address potential solutions to these sanitary checks that come on top of customs checks on many products, and that could potentially be a barrier to trade. There is no clarity at this stage on how far-reaching the arrangements could be. We're not sure that there could be a full mutual recognition that would eliminate the need for checks completely. But in any case, this aspect is a potentially highly disruptive topic, highly disruptive for trade if negotiations do not provide for a solution. So before focusing on a more detailed presentation of these sanitary and phytosanitary checks, a word of caution on what we've just explained. All topics that I mentioned as part of the negotiating guidelines come with certain conditions on the EU side. On trade, customs, professional qualifications, and indeed sanitary and phytosanitary standards, the EU is keen on securing a level playing field clause. Means that the UK could be required to keep certain rules aligned with EU standards in the areas of competition, state aids, tax, social standards, environmental standards, etc. So here the question is whether this could be acceptable for the UK and how this would be dealt with during the negotiation. So among the various topics mentioned for the future relationship in the guidelines, I'd like to focus in more details on sanitary and phytosanitary checks. There are lots of talks about customs checks in a Brexit context, but they are not the only ones. And these sanitary checks, although they are much less debated, could still prove very disruptive. So how does it work? How does it work currently, and how could it work in the future? Well, the EU imposes systematic sanitary and phytosanitary checks on imports of certain types of goods from non-EU countries. So post-Brexit, unless specific arrangements are implemented, trade flows from the UK to the EU will be concerned. Of course, not all goods are concerned, but it's not only a minor topic concerning highly specialized companies. So what products would be concerned? Well, the main category of products that would be subject to such checks are animal-based products, be it for human consumption or animal feed or for any other uses. So it includes, of course, meat, but also dairy products, processed food products containing at least 1% of meat. So it could be various things, but for example, meals containing meatballs or any other type of processed food with meat would be concerned. Processed food containing at least 50% of dairy products would be concerned as well, and fish, seafood, honey, wool, all these animal-based products. So it's already quite a long list of products, but animal-based products are not the only ones to be concerned. All animal feed, including minerals and plant-based feed, would also have to undergo such sanitary and phytosanitary checks, as well as other plant-based products, vegetables, fruits, seeds, and wood. And this is an important point because depending on the type of wood, even wooden objects can be subject to sanitary and phytosanitary checks. For example, pieces of furniture, wooden toys, or other wooden items. So you see from this list that sanitary checks and phytosanitary checks do not only concern very specialized traders or transport operators. It's quite clear that many companies could deal with such items, possibly in group-based consignments. So it is extremely important to be aware of the potential implications, and that's why we as FTA are raising awareness on this topic. So what does it mean for these products, and why would the default situation in the absence of specific arrangements be critical? Well, these products can only enter the EU through specific entry points that have to be equipped with inspection facilities with specifically trained staff. And not all ports are equipped. For example, looking at cross-channel traffic, only Dunkirk has the appropriate facilities for the time being. Calais is not equipped for now, and neither is Dover or Eurotunnel. So you can see that the location of inspection facilities does not match the trade flows necessarily. A second point of concern is that existing inspection points are not dimensioned to cope with the volumes of imports from the UK. And last but not least, sanitary and phytosanitary checks are systematic on the products we mentioned. And these checks take time and would have an important impact on supply chains. We had the opportunity to visit the port of Dunkirk a few weeks ago, thanks to the kind support and invitation of the FTS. And we could see how these inspections are carried out at the border inspection point in Dunkirk. what we've seen, what we've witnessed, is that there are three types of checks taking place at these border inspection points. The first type, document checks. So these checks consist for the authorities to review the health certificates issued by sanitary authorities of the country of origin of the goods, and they take place before the shipments arrive at the port. The second category is called identity checks. It's when authorities check whether goods have been sealed and referenced properly. They check the labels on the shipments, and so on. And the third category, physical checks. That's when boxes will be opened, temperature will be checked, and goods might be tested. And there are sometimes also additional analysis carried out in labs that could take a few days. So for physical checks, the percentage of controls vary from one type of goods to the other, and also based on the country of production. But what we can say for sure is that the frequency of sanitary and phytosanitary checks is much higher than physical customs checks, so quite important. Looking at how much time it would take, well, document checks that are required for absolutely all the products we mentioned take approximately 15 minutes per batch. And one batch means basically what is covered by one sanitary or phytosanitary certificate. To understand what it means, well, bear in mind that the different types of products, for example, fish and meat, cannot be covered by the same certificate. So a shipment containing at the same time fish and meat would have at least two certificates, and it would take twice 15 minutes, so half an hour to check the documents. This is before the shipment arrives at the port. If this step is not completely satisfactory, the shipment will be consigned for a certain number of days. And if after this delay, the applicant has not solved the issue, well, the goods will be either returned to their point of origin or even destroyed. That's just for document checks, the first step. For identity checks, looking at the seals and the labels, they take place when the products arrive at the point of entry in a border inspection port, so for example, in a port. They are mandatory for all animal-based products for human consumption, and mandatory as well for all plant-based products. So each time it takes at least, again, around 15 minutes per batch. And again, a container or a truck could contain many different batches covered by different health certificates requiring separate checks. And on top of that, physical checks will mainly take place for animal-based products for human consumption. For these products, the frequency of checks will vary based on the nature of the product. It would be, for example, 20% for beef, fish, and lamb, but 50% for game, shrimps, dairy products, or honey. And for plant-based products, the frequency of physical checks requiring opening the boxes and so on will depend on the nature of the product and the country of origin. So what I've just described is the default situation. Currently, these checks only concern containerized transport, as there is basically no rural traffic with non-EU countries. Given the capacity of current border inspection points, and given that most ports do not have the necessary facilities, and given the duration of the checks, well, it's clearly a model that is not compatible with rural traffic between the UK and the EU. So what solutions could be envisaged? A simple mutual recognition agreement, as in certain free trade agreements between the EU and foreign countries, would not be sufficient to remove document checks and identity checks. FTA is currently investigating the Swiss model, in which Swiss rules are aligned on EU rules, which allows for specific arrangements whereby there are no sanitary or phytosanitary checks at the border. And we are also investigating any other SPS agreement. So in the meantime, should you feel your activity may be particularly affected by these checks, depending on the type of products you are usually dealing with, please feel free to get in touch with us, and we would be happy to provide additional information and to research these topics in more detail for you. Of course, FTA will keep raising awareness on these challenges, both at EU level and with national authorities. So what you have to bear in mind, although I mentioned many potential changes and many potential disruptive checks and procedures, what you have to remember is that there are zero changes until Brexit. Until the end of March next year, the UK is still a member of the European Union, so all current rules and penalties apply. And if there is a transition period, if the transition period as it was described in the political agreement is secured in a legally binding withdrawal agreement, the rules will remain the same until the end of the transition period. So now is the time to really assess the impact of Brexit on your operations, to prepare contingency plans, because you still have a few months to look at that. So now, looking at what FTA has been doing, I would like to give the floor to Chris to cover the last examples of our political engagement at various levels.
Thank you very much, Sarah. As members would expect, FTA has been very active, both at a UK level and in particular trying to influence government on the key issues, but also at a European level, both with our counterparts in government. We are involved in various technical groups that are holding monthly conference calls with particularly port states, where the Foreign Commonwealth Office has posts in the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and Ireland, where we're getting both government engagement and industry engagement to ensure that the authorities, not only in the UK, but at the European level, are aware of the implications of Brexit and looking for solutions to those problems, many of which Sarah just ran through, for example, with the sanitary and phytosanitary checks. So we held a major event in the European Parliament 3 or 4 weeks ago, where we were able to draw attention to the kind of issues that are going to be affected by Brexit, and drew attention to the problems, but also put forward solutions to those issues. On the 20th of March, FTA provided a presentation to the SITL conference in Paris. This is one of the biggest logistics and conference shows in Northern Europe. And on the 26th of March, FTA took part in a roundtable with the Department of Transport on the haulage bill. The focus was very much on arrangements for international haulage post-Brexit, including how a permit system might work should it come to that, and on trailer registration of vehicles, focused on trailers used on the continent. FTA's position on permits is clear. We would prefer a liberalised agreement based on mutual recognition of the operator licence. But should it come to permits, as Sarah indicated earlier, government needs to ensure that there are enough permits to cover the economic needs without rationing or restriction. And this needs to be agreed in the negotiations with the EU. And there's been some, I think, understanding of that kind of arrangement where in following the talks and the guidelines that are issued, the European Union side were talking about the need for preserving connectivity in transport and trade with the UK. And I think that was a vital understanding that we need to keep business and trade moving. So we're working very closely with government on the future border and customs arrangements. And indeed, we have a colleague within the organisation that's currently seconded to customs that's working on aspects of AEO and other matters that need to be dealt with under the new arrangements. As indicated earlier, we're regular stakeholders and attenders at the Joint Customs Consultative Committee, where with the other major trade associations and the supply chain, we're able to help government understand the implications for industry as a result of their proposals and ideas as they emerge. We're holding regular discussions with the Channel ports, Dunkirk, as Sarah just mentioned, but also clearly Dover and Calais. And we have continued to provide oral evidence to several committees in the House of Lords and Commons. And indeed, today, my colleague, James Hookham, has this morning given oral evidence to the House of Lords EU External Affairs Committee on the customs arrangements. And really, the officials there really want to understand how customs really works, you know, so it's taking them through a shipment or a series of shipments using different modes of transport for them to get an understanding of that. And as you know, Sarah has indicated, through our Brussels office and through our team in Brussels, both Sarah and Pauline Bastidon, we're very active in Brussels on the continental side, and that means liaison with the Barnier Task Force on transport matters, other Commission departments that have a keen interest in facilitating the new arrangements and overcoming some of the difficulties that presents. And as always, our main goal is to raise awareness about the challenges and the need to overcome those challenges and how we can adapt to the requirements on both sides of the border. Because as we've repeatedly made clear, there are two sides to the border. It's not just a question of the UK. So just next slide, please, Sarah. Just to give you an indication of future FTA events and activities to keep you up to speed with the latest developments. Just want to remind you that we have a weekly Brexit digest, and this really does go into considerable detail into what is happening every week. And if you want to get hold of that and sign up and register for that, you can contact Pauline Bastidon with the email address on the slide. And really, places are beginning to fill up quite fast now, but we held last year a very, very successful Brexit conference, a Keep Trading Britain conference on the 20th of June. So if you really want to get underneath this, please take the opportunity of signing up for that as soon as possible. Our next Brexit seminar will be on the 17th of May, so if it's not in your diary, please do so. And if you're attending multimodal conference and show on the 2nd of May. FTA has a seminar program on that day, and we have a leading session on Brexit. So you'll be, if you're there, there'll be opportunities to come along to that and meet us, and in particular pose any questions you might have. I'd like to now conclude the webinar, and I'd like to thank you for your attention and joining us today. In addition to what I've just told you, you can get more information on the implications of Brexit, which are posted on our website at fta.co.uk/Brexit. And just to remind you, there are no questions that have been registered by delegate attendees. So we will be placing this webinar on the website, which should be up and running by tomorrow. So please download it if you need to, and I'm sure you'll pass it on to those others in your organisation that might find this appropriate. So I'd like to thank you for your attendance and close the webinar now. Thank you very much. Goodbye.